Welcome back to Between Two Wings. I'm your host, Jay Wiles, and today we're here with Deon Mitton. He's a commercial seaplane pilot who's done some incredible flying, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about it. Thank you so much for coming on, Deon.
Hey, Jay, how's it going? Thanks very much for having me.
Awesome. It's great to have you. The first thing we'd love to talk about is our backgrounds, what we've got going on behind us. For me, my image is one that I took on a seaplane flight out of Juneau, Alaska last May. My wife and I ended up taking a day trip kind of last minute when we were on a cruise, and it was an experience I'll never forget. We got to fly over several glaciers, land in a lake, visit a lodge in the middle of nowhere, but it was one of my most amazing memories that I have.
Yep, that sure looks familiar, Southeast Alaska. Well, I have a wilderness lake as well. It's at an undisclosed location. No, I'll take that back. It's about 65, 70 miles, depending on how you route, to the east of Anchorage, which in terms of regions is known as also the South Central region of Alaska. And it's a 206. You can see a little bit of the 206 in the image. On straight floats, I was dropping off some fishermen at this lake. There's a Forest Service cabin, so they go there in the summertime to go fish and have fun.
That's awesome. That looks like such an amazing picture. I love that. So Deon, you've had some incredible experiences in aviation. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into flying?
Yeah, so I was not brought up in aviation, like many people can relate to that. I had to DIY my flying credentials. So it started in it started in childhood times when obviously I was fascinated with the stuff overhead, looked up at the skies and all of that. I finally worked a few years, and then in the early 90s, I got my PPL in Southern Africa in Cape Town. Of course, that's ICAO jurisdiction. And from my PPL, I kept on flying. I participated in a bunch of interesting competitive flying disciplines. Rally flying is a big European EASA type of discipline. So that taught me a lot of interesting things about spot landings, handling the aircraft in terms of a cross-country kind of a discipline, and just seat of the pants flying, which was really a lot of fun. Fast forward 20 teens. I was in corporate America. I made a career in technology, and I finally decided to call an end to that, dust off so I've been flying along, all of these years as a PPL. Finally got curious enough about helicopter flying, got myself a helicopter FAA ticket. And from that, I decided I really wanted to be on an island, live the island lifestyle, fly seaplane if possible. And so I put in the time to build all the certificates in the FAA system, which of course, as the plan would have it, would be seaplane, single engine C, commercial instrument, and later on also did my multi-instrument. So those are the ratings that I hold in terms of the FAA system. And then my career started in seaplane flying.
That's wonderful. And you've had some incredible opportunities to fly in some amazing places. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into that?
So after I visited Alaska in mid 2005 or six, the floatplane world really opened up to me. So one of the images that I had in my mind in terms of location and visualizing my lifestyle would be the Alaska wilderness, of course, but there was also a component that had palm trees and Caribbean tropical waters. So I joined a company in Florida that would allow me to operate a float plane into the tropical environment. And then from that, I had the good fortune to also operate that caravan, which was part of that fleet, into the Caribbean and also New York on the East River, as they would call it, flying the river in New York. And then subsequent to that, I made the transition to Alaska and joined a company in Alaska and did the same thing, fly floats for the summer season.
That's wonderful. So you've flown in some amazing parts of the world. They're pretty different though. So could you talk a little bit about the challenges that you faced in flying in those different regions?
Yeah, there's quite a depending on how you look at it from a piloting perspective, there are a few really distinct challenges. If we just look at those three environments, first the Caribbean or the island operation, we're dealing with international operation. So it's crossing the ADIS, crossing the international boundary, in and out of the FAA system, which is interesting on its own. But then also when you're crossing and flying between jurisdictions in some of the island nations, you're essentially crossing FIR boundaries, which means you're going from one jurisdiction into the airspace of another country. So the interesting challenges there is not only the ATC and the communications piece of it, but it's also the mode of operating. You'll go from a metric to a imperial system, for example, where it'd be switching QNH to altimeter, setting inches of mercury and millibars. So in terms of cockpit procedure, communications procedure, crossing between these FIRs, and we're not flying at the flight level, so we're cruising below 10,000 feet for the most part in float. So it gets interesting. Also the lingo, the vocabulary of the different ATC systems, some of the, reference, it's a non-radared environment for the most part in the Caribbean. So part of the challenge there is to, obviously for the ATC is to maintain separation, which is their primary function in the Caribbean. And this is what some of the pilots there might relate to, is they'll reference waypoints or position reporting points relative to NDBs, decommissioned or in-op NDBs, but in some ways they still have it on their map and they still like to reference that NDB. So you better be ready to dial it in on the map and get a reciprocal and stuff like that. Then the New York airspace, of course, is just plenty busy with 3 Bravos almost overlapping between Newark, Kennedy, and LaGuardia. So that on its own presents the challenges of busy airspace controlled and in the instrument system airspace. And then you throw into the mix the float operation, which is VFR daytime only on and off the water. In any of those weather scenarios, we'd be operating on and off the river VFR in an exclusion below the Bravo, essentially a cutout below the Bravo, which is very busy. It's on its own definition, very busy with helicopter and float plane and also other, GA traffic. The transition between that uncontrolled airspace in and out of the Bravo airspace makes it really tricky, because you're in a very densely populated airspace with fixed wing and rotor wing mixing. Now, all helicopter pilots will know that that's a no-no. You try and explicitly avoid conflicting traffic between those two types. Of course, the river forces us to fly in the same airspace, so that's challenging. And then once you're airborne, let's say on a departure scenario, you have to enter or exit that airspace, you have to transition essentially controlled class Bravo airspace. So there's a period when you're climbing out after takeoff from the river, you have to remain within the lateral boundaries and the vertical limits too. But you have just a small window in time between taking off, talking, to the other traffic in the area, and then getting on with, let's say, LaGuardia Tower. And sometimes it's just difficult to get a word in sideways. So you're sitting, you're almost ready to transition, you're at the right altitude, but you just cannot get on the channel with them. And what that means is you have to remain outside the Bravo, as everybody would know. And that means remaining overhead, this very confined piece of airspace that has lateral limits, the shorelines. If you have to continue circling within that area, it requires fairly aggressive maneuvering, which is not quite ideal with a full load of passengers. It can be done safely, but it's a little unnerving with the passengers in the back if you're making really steep turns and you're flying directly towards buildings. So we try and avoid that, but it has its challenges. The other piece of the New York airspace, which gets really interesting, late summer, there's a lot of climatic conditions that bring a lot of moisture off of the Atlantic. So we're dealing typically with late summer marine layer scenarios, which is down to minimum. So the interesting scenario is getting off, let's say you're getting airborne off of the East River headed to East Long Island. You already know that you're dealing with a 1,500 or 2,000 foot ceiling, so you can get into the Bravo remaining clear of IFR conditions, but soon thereafter you need to get into the IFR system so that you can get sequenced for your approach, which is about 30 minutes later into flying an instrument approach at a runway there. So that's all fine and well, and the instrument system gets really tied up and really backed up, and you might be number 20 in the queue, even just after getting airborne. Already know you're number 20 or something like that. Then the added complexity of having to miss an approach and having to divert to your alternate. Now, with the marine layer conditions, odds are your alternates within 10 or 20 miles are also going to be below minimum. So fuel planning becomes really interesting in that scenario. And people that have flown around the Long Island Sound know that those conditions can be fairly widespread. So now you're dealing with a commercial operation, max gross of the water with payload, passenger payload, and fuel, and trying to manage the alternates in a safe manner. And that gets really interesting.
Yeah, that sounds like a big challenge.
Yeah, it's a fun one. Alaska, of course, has a totally different environment, uncontrolled airspace, but with lots of terrain, lots of weather, almost no fuel en route. So the challenges become your fuel management. And as people that have flown in Alaska knows, both from a common sense perspective and a compliance perspective, carrying survival gear is not only mandatory, but also makes a lot of sense. So when you're departing out of any airfield or semi-controlled air space where, let's say, for example, Anchorage, where you do have some air traffic control and some information in terms of weather briefing, within 10 or 15 minutes, you're out of controlled airspace, you're in the backcountry, you're in a wilderness survival type of scenario should anything happen, whether it's a precautionary landing or an unplanned event that you have to land at a location where you didn't design to go. So the challenge from a single pilot perspective, which is the operations for the most part out of Anchorage, is dealing with all those scenarios. And I would say the biggest dimension of challenge there is aeronautical decision making. Because as a single pilot, you're juggling a few, many scenarios that you have to constantly adjust. It's a very dynamic environment. So besides, again, terrain and climatic conditions, you're also dealing with fuel and endurance and the fact that you're flying in a totally off-grid environment.
That's so interesting, just learning about flying in all types of airspace. So Deon, you've done all of these different types of flying. What's next?
Yeah, Jay, that's an interesting question. My initial check ride, the examiner ended our ride, which had a happy outcome, and his parting thoughts were, in flying, if you ever land at the end of a flight or get to the end of the day and you didn't have fun or you did not learn something, make sure you go back and you fix those two things, do what you need to do. So I carry that forward in my aviation hobby, then turned profession. And I'd like to respond in the same manner. If, I'll pursue aviation activities that continue to be fun and where I know I can learn a lot. So on my radar, there's the potential of getting involved in business aviation. I think there's plenty of interesting challenges getting into operating in that regime, both from a technology perspective, the crewing perspective. The flying activity could be fairly interesting and challenging. I think it could be a lot of fun. In addition to actually manipulating the controls, I'm also expanding my reach in terms of content, digital content production. And what I found over the many years that I've been involved in aviation, both professionally and non-professionally, is there's such a rich community of activities around different kinds of flying, different kinds of activities where aviation play a key role in communities, whether it's urban or more rural locations, for example, Alaska. And I found that I've expanded my network of people in very, very interesting parts of the globe. For example, the Scandinavian regions up into the Arctic, the Alaska parts up into the Arctic as well, and some of the tropical areas, and even in the African continent. So I'd like to continue to use my my other skills in terms of photography and perhaps digital content creation, and to bring more of those stories to the greater community for the purpose of inspiring the next generations when they want to pursue aviation as a lifestyle, whether it's just a career or getting involved, even from a non-flying perspective, non-flight crew perspective. Aviation, I think, is one of those industries that truly can offer a lifestyle, no matter which way you look at it. And I think telling those stories and using that to motivate the next and inspire the next generation is potentially a very meaningful cause. So that's one of the ways I'd like to give back to the community and back to the next generations.
Well, Deon, thank you so much for coming on Between Two Wings. It's been really great to talk with you today.
Oh, Jay, thank you guys and 4Flight and the whole team for making this happen. I really enjoy, obviously, your products. I use it extensively in all those environments where I've operated, even internationally. I'm one of the persons that will also get in a commercial jetliner and have 4Flight, following along. So I do love the product. Of course, I think not only from a entertainment perspective in that mode, but it is just such a rich ecosystem. It's really helpful from a safety and a situational awareness perspective. So thank you for what you guys are doing. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. It's on the commercial airliners, it's always fun to have it up and people in the seat next to you are like, huh, what is that? That looks really cool. So it's always fun.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Thanks, Deon. And thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of Between Two Wings. We'll see you next time.